Welcome back. We're talking about what Jews believe. Today we'll be moving on to talk about the Torah and religious law. As I mentioned last time, some think of Judaism as a religion of actions. There are rituals to perform, there are holidays to observe, you perform good deeds, sometimes called mitzvot, which we'll talk about a bit later. It's about action much more than theological belief, they imagine. Although I will point out that a lot of those rituals and holidays, even good deeds, are associated with reciting specific blessings or reciting certain prayers that have belief implied in them, at least. After all, you're talking to a God who does things, or praising a God, or thanking a God, or petitioning a God. I mean, some of those things you're supposed to say are not belief neutral. They're making a claim. And that's one of the reasons why I think those people that think that Judaism is just a religion of action are not being accurate. What Jews believe is actually pretty important. There are certainly texts in the tradition that talk about this, as we looked at last time. But what people believe also affects what they choose to do. So as just one example, and we're going to be talking about today, is the concept of Jewish law. The idea that there's a whole list of commandments that Jews are expected to perform, and do they? If they don't, then maybe that means they don't believe that a God who watches them and is keeping track of everything and who knows if you've been sleeping and knows if you were awake and knows what you ate last week, if there isn't that kind of a God running things, then maybe they feel more flexible to do other things. That's where belief affects action. So as one example, we're drawing on this book, Open Judaism by Rabbi Barry Schwartz. And Schwartz, in talking about this concept of what do you believe about the Torah, quotes a Gallup poll from 2015. He says, when asked about the Bible, 28% of Americans, this is Americans in general, 28% of Americans in general said the Bible is the actual word of God and is to be taken literally word for word. 47% said the Bible is the inspired word of God, but not everything in it should be taken literally. And 21% said the Bible is an ancient book of fables, legends, history, and moral precepts recorded by humans. Now, whether there was some divinity behind that, that's up in the air. But you can see there's not a consensus at all among Americans more broadly as to the nature of the Bible. Was it the actual word of God that's literal? Well, that's about 28%. Is it inspired by God, but not literal necessarily? That's about half. And then another 20% say it's an ancient book of fables, legends, and history. That's where I would have landed in that survey. Or to give you another example of Jews making choices from this Torah and tradition, I want to show you some results from the 2020 Pew Survey of American Jews that explores this question. Did Jews attend a Seder? Well, the Seder is one of those commandments, something that Jews are expected to do. 62% held or participated in a Seder last year. Now notice this survey was done in 2020, so that would apply to 2019. It wasn't a COVID year. And still, only 60% of Jews participated in a Seder. 60% observed a ritual to mark a milestone, like a bar, bat mitzvah, wedding, funeral, something like that. And 46% fasted all or part of last Yom Kippur. Well, the commandment is to fast for all of Yom Kippur and for everyone, every adult to fast, unless they're in a severe, medical condition or pregnant or something like that. Well, if only half of Jews fasted on Yom Kippur, maybe they're deciding that fasting on Yom Kippur is, well, certainly less important than going to the Seder, but definitely not something that they all choose to do because they're free to choose. Well, here's another example, marking Shabbat. 39%, if you look at that bold upper left corner number, 39% often or sometimes mark Shabbat in a way that's meaningful to them. But 59% rarely or never mark Shabbat in a way meaningful to them. And fully a third of American Jews, 37%, never mark Shabbat in a way that's meaningful to them. Now, that's about as flexible as you get, right? as meaningful to you. Not did you make sure all the lights were set at the correct setting before sundown? Did you light candles? Did you say the special blessing on wine? Did you, follow all the prohibitions on work? Did you not drive a car? Did you not use? They're not asking any of that. They're making it as vague as possible. Doing Shabbat in a way meaningful to you, and still 37% never do that. Well, that reflects a sense that Shabbat is not commanded on them, either in the restrictions or even in the positive celebration. Here's another example. Keeping kosher. Most Jews know something of kosher rules, but only 17% of Jews keep kosher. Notice that only 25% of conservative Jews keep kosher in their home. Only 5% of Reform Jews. Now, 95% of Orthodox Jews do. Makes sense, right? But again, only 17% of the Jewish population in America as a whole keeps kosher. Even those Jews who define themselves as Jewish by religion, it's only 22% of that group. So that's, again, an example where this idea of a commandment, we know it's commanded, but most of us don't care. There are two Jewish restaurants in one strip mall in Highland Park, right at the corner of Lake Cook Road and Skokie Valley Road and Skokie Highway. One is a kosher restaurant. It's called Mizrahi Grill, serves wonderful Middle Eastern food. And right next to it is a Jewish deli named Max's Deli. That's clearly not kosher if you look at their menu. They serve milk with meat. They serve non-kosher meat. But they serve bagels and kugel and matzo ball soup and all these foods that are connected to being Jewish. In fact, the same survey asked about what do you do that's Jewish in cultural sense. 72% of American Jews cook or eat Jewish foods. So they would care a lot more about what's available at Max's Deli than whether or not it's kosher. Think about your own experience, right? The Jewish food connection might be more important as a family thing, as a ritual thing, or just as a taste thing than whether or not it's kosher. And then as a last example, attending religious services, right? It's about a religion of action. You're supposed to show up and do things. Only 20% of American Jews attend synagogue monthly or more. Only 12% attend weekly. You're supposed to show up 3 times a week to have a minyan, to say the prayers. And 10% say they show up at least weekly. But 52%, all the way on the right side of the column, 52% seldom or never attend services. And if you combine a few times a year and seldom or never, you get 80%, 79%, 80% of American Jews who seldom or never or few times a year attend religious services. Now, this survey actually asked people, why don't you attend? Oop, I hit the wrong button there. They asked people, why don't you attend? Many of them are not synagogue members. Again, only 35% have someone in the household who's a synagogue member. The most common reason they don't attend religious services, I'm not religious. I'm just not interested. I express my Jewishness in other ways. So these are not people who are simply obeying commandments because they were told to do so. And these are not people who believe that the Hebrew Bible, with all of its pronouncements, or the Torah, those first 5 books, is authoritative in telling you exactly what you need to do with your life. This is the world that Barry Schwartz is trying to describe when he talks about Torah and religious law in his comparison of different varieties of being Jewish. And this book is an attempt to try to summarize what Jews believe, assuming that Jews believe a variety of things. Not that there's one Jewish belief that everybody should ascribe to, and the 80% who aren't listening are wrong. On the other hand, by contrast, what Schwartz is trying to do is show the variety of Jewish beliefs on these core issues. So today we're looking at the Torah and Jewish religious law. So the first thing I have to clarify is, what is the Torah? Because the concept of Torah is broader in Jewish life than just the first 5 books. Now, if we're in a synagogue, you open an ark, you see a big scroll there, That's the Torah with the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. You could find those, by the way, in a printed Bible too. It'd just be the first part. The rest of the Hebrew Bible doesn't make it into the scroll. That's a separate thing. However, the idea of Torah as revelation gets broadened. So then it becomes the rest of the Hebrew Bible. Sometimes people say Torah, but they really mean the whole Hebrew Bible. Sometimes people say Torah and they mean all of rabbinic law, including what's called the Talmud, which we'll talk about in the second half today. Sometimes they mean teachings that are done even today, creative teachings on Jewish life, on ethics, on values, maybe using a Torah verse or a concept as a spark to start the program. But in the end, sometimes even that new teaching based on the old is also called Torah. The key question for us, and that Jews grapple with, is what is the authority of that original 5 books, those list of commandments? Where does it come from, and do we have to listen to it? Now, Schwartz divides his chapters into 3 sections, as we saw last time. He has the traditionalist approach, he has the atheist or humanist approach as the opposite end of the spectrum, and then he has the people that land in the middle. And roughly configured, you have the traditionalist is the same as Orthodox. The atheist humanist in the middle is either humanistic Judaism or sometimes reconstructing Judaism. And then the agnostic, as he calls it, is really the reformer conservative Jews, where they're somewhere in between the fully secular and the fully traditional. So what do these different groups have to say about the Torah? Well, as you might expect, the traditionalists are very authoritative when it comes to what the Torah means. This is Schwartz's summary. Traditional Judaism believes in the all-important idea of direct revelation. The Torah is God-given. It was revealed at one time in one place to one person. Remarkably, it has been passed down to us generation to generation unchanged. The Torah may be a history book, the early experience of a Jewish people. It may be a literature book, the lore and law of our Israelite ancestors. But for the believer, the Torah is above all a holy book, the code of commandments God wants us to follow. And therefore, not only is it important to treat the book with reverence and with value, but it's also important to study the book. Now, I don't know how many of you read the manual when you buy something new. I personally tend not to. I just open it up and start fooling around with it. But if God gave you the manual for the universe and your life and society, wouldn't you read it? Wouldn't you read it a few times? Wouldn't you read it over and over and over again and study it and explain it and explore it and discuss it? Sure. Well, that's the concept here, you see. God has given the Jewish people the manual to everything. And so you study it and you study it. There's a Torah portion system where you're reading a portion of the Torah every day. And so every year you go through the entire thing and then you start over again and read it again. And even the study of the Torah becomes its own virtue. Here's a quote from an Orthodox authority named J. David Blake that Schwartz quotes. Judaism is unique in its teaching that study is not merely a means but an end. Not merely an end among ends, but the highest and noblest of human aspirations. Study of Torah for its own sake is a sacramental act, the greatest of all mitzvot, the greatest of all the commandments. Every Jew, regardless of the degree of erudition he has attained, devoted a portion of his time to Torah learning in the old country. To the Jew, Torah study has always been more than a ritual act. It has been a religious experience because it's like you're hearing God talk. You're reading the book that God wrote. It's like a new revelation every time. Now, we might disagree that the study of the Torah is the most important of all the commandments. We might decide that, I don't know, loving your neighbor maybe is a little more important, or caring for the widow and the orphan, or not oppressing the workers, or, pick your commandment if you want to. We might focus more on the ethical between human being commandments than the commandment to study the law over and over again. But that's the concept in the traditional world, that this is God's revelation, and its study is one of the most important things that one can do to understand all those other rules and to understand how the universe itself is put together and what God wants from you, right? So what is the atheist approach to the Torah? Very different, of course, because we start from the assumption that even if it says God wrote it, we still think people did. So here's Schwartz's summary, and I think it's a good summary of a humanistic take on the Torah. The Torah is the national epic of the Jewish people, written by a variety of people over more than 1,000 years with varying, even contradictory perspectives. It contains sublime literature and lofty ethical teachings, yet it also contains not so sublime literature and less than lofty ethical teachings. As a human document, the Torah is fallible like its authors. Its history might be unreliable. Its expressions of rituals may be archaic. Its ethical prescriptions may fall short of the test of reason. The Torah is holy only in that it can connect us to our ancestors and to the best within ourselves. But in these regards, the Torah is no different than other great literature. It's a book. It's actually a series of books. They're important books. They're valuable as our cultural heritage. We may still find principles that we support and celebrate, but it's not divine. It's not uncriticizable. It's not untouchable. It's made by people. And so it's wonderful and it's flawed and it's limited and it's from its time and place. It's a book. When the first humanistic Jewish congregation built their building, they intentionally put the Torah scroll in the library to make the point that it's a book. It's in a place of honor. You can't check it out. Like, it's not in the card catalog, it's non-circulating. But it is in the library with the other books. And so, that's our approach, is that in some level, it's just a book. Now, the Reconstructing Judaism movement had a similar perspective. In fact, he quotes Mordechai Kaplan, the founding thinker of that movement, saying that the critical analysis of the Torah text by modern scholars and a scientific outlook on history renders a belief in revelation untenable. We know that Torah is a human document, recording the experience of our people in its quest for God in its formative period. So he accepts it was written by people. But where Kaplan tries to salvage something of revelation, and this is actually the term that Schwartz uses describing Reconstructing Judaism, he tries to salvage the idea of the Torah as a sacred text because he says, even though we no longer assume that every word is literally or even figuratively true, the reading of the Torah enables us to relive in imagination the experiences of our forefathers in seeking to make life conform to the will of God. The discovery of religious truth is God's revelation to us. In other words, what he means by God here is our highest ideals, a source that works through nature and its laws. Morals are not just made up by people, they exist independently and part of this sort of source for truth. And revelation for Kaplan is the discovery of this truth. So he still tries to keep that word revelation, even if it's a human author document, because we are having revealed to us what our ancestors thought about the universe and where they drew their highest ideals. Now, some people will hear that and it will really resonate with them. But some of them will hear that and say, what? What do you mean, the source of all our ideals? Isn't that us also? You're positing something beyond us that is a source of value? Well, that's, you look at a cloud and you see one thing and someone looks at the same cloud and sees something else. But we both agree that people wrote the book. Now, when it comes to the reformer conservative movement, their perspective is also that people wrote the book. Except for them, it was people plus some kind of divine influence. As Schwartz summarizes it, divinely inspired but humanly written. So there's still some divinity back there that's pushing the buttons, that's dropping the seeds of thought, that's whispering in the ear of the person who's writing it, but it's still written by people in a certain time in a certain place. So you'll sometimes hear, as Schwartz describes it, indirect revelation. Instead of a direct revelation from God to Moses, it's indirect revelation of, to the scholars who then compile the book. Or a progressive revelation where different generations retell the story in new ways, and then it gets combined into one book, and that becomes a gradual understanding of the will of God. Or in another phrase, he quotes, continuous revelation. The idea that later generations, as they're interpreting, are also somehow revealing either what was latent in the text or what God is continuing to share with them as they study this document. Now, I mentioned last time a statement by the conservative movement issued in the late 1980s called Emet v'Emunah, which means truth and faith. And they have a nice passage in that document that speaks about their approach to revelation. As is often the case in the conservative movement, they're trying to include lots of ideas that are within the spectrum of conservative Judaism, and this will include basically what Reform would have said also. So here they're describing this idea of this revelation. And they see this revelation happening in some kind of event at Sinai, but also a process that didn't end there. So they're trying to have both the Sinai revelation and some kind of ongoing revelation. Some of us conceive, here's the paragraph here, some of us conceive of revelation as the personal encounter between God and human beings. Among them, there are those who believe this personal encounter has propositional content. God communicated with actual words. And for them, revelation's content is immediately normative, as defined by rabbinic interpretation, and the commandments of the Torah issue from God. Others, however, believe that revelation consists of an ineffable human encounter with God. No words. The experience of revelation inspires the verbal formulation by human beings of norms and ideas, thus continuing. That's that, again, that divinely inspired but humanly written, right? The idea comes from a God, but the people are doing the writing. And there are still others. Others among us conceive of revelation as the continuing discover through nature and history of truths about God and the world. These truths, although always culturally conditioned, are nevertheless seen as God's ultimate purpose for creation. Proponents of this view tend to see revelation as an ongoing process rather than a specific event. Again, they're trying to save that concept of revelation. They're trying to save a moment at Sinai, whatever that was, even if it wasn't the entire Torah being given all at once. But there's a dilemma that's left. If you think it's a progressive revelation, it came from a certain time and place, some of it was written by God, some was written by people, or inspired by God, but mediated through human authors. The challenge for this group, as Schwartz summarizes it, what is the kernel and what is the husk? What is timely and what is timeless? What parts are divinely inspired and what parts are humanly uninspired? This approach to Torah picks and chooses, accepts and rejects, preserves and discards. Some call this blasphemy. Some call this lazy. But to be a committed agnostic who is unsure which parts of the Torah to hold on to is not easy. One scholar, Morgenstern, said, we must take the Bible not literally, but seriously. That's that middle ground, trying to preserve some concept of revelation while still accepting that people wrote it and maybe some of the values are not timeless. After all, its condemnation of homosexuality today, most liberal Jews totally reject. And yet it's there in black and white in the text that a man who lies with a man as with a woman is an abomination. So you have to decide, is that figurative language? Is that just the human mediation of an ultimate encounter? It doesn't fit our values, so what do we do with it? The secularist is easy, has an easy answer. That was from the early Iron Age, and we don't have to live by it. The traditionalist says, I'm stuck with this. And maybe I can parse around it, or maybe I just have to conform to its values. And you hear stories of people leaving Orthodoxy because they are some variety of LGBT, and they simply can't find a home in a world that says, this is normative, what says in the Torah, and you are wrong. So they have to find somewhere else. But those who live in the middle, who accept some as divine and some as not, they have to grapple with this dilemma of a text that doesn't reflect their values. I'm never puzzled by a text that doesn't reflect my values because it's my ancestral text, but I don't have to agree with it all the time because people wrote it. In the end, the Torah divides the Jewish community, writes Schwartz, and the Torah unites the Jewish community. So many of the stories we tell, the history we recite, the Judaism we practice comes from the Torah. The Hebrew Bible in particular, and the wisdom of Jewish literature in general, is the cherished possession of all Jews. So even if we don't think there was a Sinai, we get the joke. We know the reference. We understand the concept, and we should know the story. We do this every Passover in a humanistic Seder, where we say, this is the story of our people, the story of the Exodus, which may never have happened in history. But the story has value as literature, as ideas, as inspiration, and that's why we still study it. So with that, I want to stop for a moment and ask for your thoughts on what the authority of the Torah means for you, what your perspective is on who wrote it, how authoritative is it, what's its source, and how rigidly we should follow it, how we should approach these stories and these laws.
For me, I find a lot of the Torah sort of irrelevant.
You actually read the whole thing.
I did, and a lot of my problem has to do with animal sacrifice and with rules that don't make any sense, like mixing linen with, can't mix this stuff. And I mean, this stuff is so out of, not to mention, like, most of Numbers is about building a tabernacle. It's that kind of stuff that I don't find very meaningful. And I think that in reading the Hebrew Bible, as I did with the annotations, the question is, how do we say that this is the word for word of God when, in fact, we're not even sure what some of the words mean from classical Hebrew, and that there are multiple meanings occasionally depending on which of the vowels that they voiced it with, and we don't know, which would change the actual meaning of a sentence. So that becomes very problematical.
Just to note, the vowels were added several centuries after the consonantal text was set.
Right. So we don't know how they may have voiced things. We guess, there's a context. I'm not a scholar in this, but I found it really interesting. But I still think, but there is still value in understanding how our ancestors approached the world and thought about the world, and how they tried to do things as a heritage for us to understand. But there's very little in there that I'm going to follow in terms of what it says.
Well, one other point, thanks, Lori. One other point to consider is that it's a basic building block of Western culture through the mediation of Christianity, right? I mean, Christians read the Binding of Isaac story too. They just call it the sacrifice of Isaac because for them, this prefigures a later story in their sequel where another father is willing to sacrifice his child for the good of whatever. Right, that's the Jesus story. So the Binding of Isaac in Genesis prefigures the crucifixion of Jesus, and if you read the Gospel of John, it's made even more explicit because Jesus is on the cross when they're sacrificing the lambs in the temple before Passover. So that's a case of seeing that. But again, we get the jokes. We know the reference because it's drawing on Hebrew literature, and you want to understand, Renaissance art. You want to understand English literature, Shakespeare. Read your Hebrew Bible. I mean, there's a lot there that we don't even realize comes from there. I mean, the book of Proverbs has birthed so many sayings that are in the English language you don't even realize they're biblical. So it's understanding the culture we're in now. It's not just a case of looking at what's in the past.
I went to an exhibition of Rembrandt's when I was in Amsterdam last year, and his fellows at the same time. And a significant proportion of the paintings were in fact biblical themes, that if you didn't know what they were, you wouldn't understand it.
Right. There's a comment from Michael in the box. It's basically, to summarize, making the point that a lot of the traditional Jewish commentary texts the Torah, Torah commentaries, what's called Midrash, which is stories based on the biblical stories, or the Talmud, are based on an assumption that God wrote it. So if you want to appreciate the later books, you have to sort of put on the as-if glasses, to understand it from their worldview what they're doing. And you can decide whether it's worth it to enter that world and see the world through their lenses, or if you want to critique that literature in the same way that you do the original, that's certainly our right as moderns to be able to see in multiple ways. This is one of those cases where I don't judge the rabbis for looking at it with their eyes, but I also don't give them authority to tell me what I'm allowed to do when I look at the text. And I guess the last point to make is there's nothing wrong with reading a book multiple ways. You could read the Hebrew Bible through a feminist lens. You could read the Hebrew Bible through an LGBTQ lens. You could read the Bible through a scientific lens. How accurate are they? You can read it through a historical lens compared to archaeology. You can read it through all these different ways of studying. And so one of them can be the traditional mindset, the traditional worldview, as if Moses got the whole thing on Mount Sinai. But that doesn't negate, it doesn't eliminate the other readings as plausible and sometimes important readings. One last thought, and I'll recognize Jessica. If you did not know when Shakespeare lived or anything about the society in which he lived, that would diminish your understanding of Shakespeare. You could still read Hamlet. You could still read Merchant of Venice or any of the other wonderful and sometimes challenging plays that he's written, Merchant of Venice specifically. You could still enjoy the language, but knowing when he lived and what was happening in the world around him impacts your understanding of Shakespeare. So that would be my approach to the Hebrew Bible. Yes, I can appreciate it as literature, just as stories. I can appreciate it as the rabbis understood it as revelation, but I can also appreciate it as a document of its time because that will help me understand it in a different lens. Yes, Jessica.
I guess I'd add two other points. I have read the Torah, but in English, several annotations. So even looking at different annotations gives you different perspective. But
Correct.
If you work with people, you understand that people want structure, which sort of means they want to be told what to do, most of them, whether they acknowledge it or not. There's just a very small majority who don't, and who are aware that they don't. And, especially Americans, they may say they don't, but then they still do. So that's one point. And then the other point is, when you're trying to organize people into society and have people be moral when they don't have a moral compass, it provides a moral compass. And it also provides stories and perspectives that allow people to understand it, because that's the way a lot of people understand and or follow. You can't just say, don't do this, don't do that. You have to paint the picture, what happened, the consequence and why. And to the degree that the Torah does that, it was effective for both, perpetuating the idea of a God and then also controlling the populace and quote unquote explaining why, anyway.
Right, for sure. I see Janet hand up too.
So I found it very interesting when I took the class, your class about the history of the Torah and looking at it from an archaeological point of view. And it very much resonated with me, which is, why I'm part of this congregation. But before that, and when I was having, I don't think I thought too much about doubts or faiths. I just, I liked looking at the laws, so the Torah, where they come from, as, basically you got a bunch of illiterate sheep herders running around, and you don't sit there and say, well, we need to not eat pork because we could get trichinosis. Somehow someone figured out this, and rather than try and explain this to the vast majority, we make it a commandment. And that's kind of, we bathe regularly. And yeah, so that's kind of how I explained to myself. Then when I took your course, I really enjoyed hearing the different views and seeing how some of the parts of the Bible are written with totally different language and totally different reference to God and different names for God. And I found it fascinating. And at this point, I feel Torah to me is an interesting part of history. I also read other histories. I read romantic fiction, historical fiction that is also entertaining and helps me understand what it was like living in those times. And that's where it is for me now. It's like, God, what was it like to live in those times and worry about, my grandmother fully embraced religion being the opiate of the masses. And that's how I was, taught. And I can see why. I mean, how do you control people who aren't ready to think for themselves yet, maybe?
Well, one of the debates is whether the people writing the Torah were making it up, that God spoke to them or that God gave these commandments. Was this like a pious fraud? Did they really believe it? Or is the fact that it would be kind of implausible to say that, thousands of people saw this revelation in Mount Sinai and have people actually believe, like, could you really put that over on people? I think, recent history has shown us you can put just about anything over on people. And at least some of them will believe
Sadly,
it.
indeed.
Yeah.
I mean, and now that I've found and feel comfortable with these beliefs, I don't feel like I have to go back and think about it. Like, okay, I'm justifying this as with the science of it as a justification. It's just more, you said, well, I don't believe God wrote it because I don't believe in God. And so I don't necessarily want to believe that it was a group of leaders trying to pull one over on everybody, although it very well may have been, or may have been convenient as a way to govern at that point. But whether they believed in it themselves or not, well, that's just a guess.
Well, one last comment I'll add, and then I see Rami's hand as well. The power of ancestral tradition is very deeply rooted in human culture. If your ancestors thought this, if your grandparents thought this, then you should agree with them. In today's society, it's the opposite, right? That we think the newest version has got to be true, and what do old people have to say about anything? But in the ancient world, if I said I heard a story from my father, who heard it from his father, who heard it from his father, who heard it from his father, that was more believable. And we'll see examples of that in rabbinic literature in a little bit. And certainly in the Islamic tradition, there's something called the Hadith, the stories about Muhammad that go back by word of mouth. And the further back it goes to Muhammad, the more plausible it is. Of course, today we have an invention called telephone. And the game of telephone, where if I whisper something to you and you whisper something to someone else and you whisper that to someone else, we think it's less believable. The more hearsay, the further back it goes. That's our change in mentality, to not trust the chain of authority.
Well, and then that's what leads us to things like, well, how can you believe in science? It keeps changing.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll talk about that in a future class. Rami, please.
Well, I'm completely new to all of this. I didn't grow up with any religious education. My education was totally experiential throughout my life. And one of the things I found throughout my life was that I had experiences that I couldn't explain. And when I had experiences that I couldn't explain, there was always someone around me who made the attribution. That's God, or that's the guru, or that's the teacher. There's something outside of myself, which I then believed until I no longer believe that. So I have a very strong allergy to attribution to something beyond that which is not me. That's all I wanted to share.
Great. All right, so let's talk about the second part of this, which is this concept of religious law. As we mentioned, many pieces of the Torah itself are focused on law. In fact, in the annual cycle of reading the Torah, we just moved on to a Torah portion last week called Mishpatim, which is starting in Exodus 21. We leave behind the wonderful stories of Genesis and the confrontation of Moses and Pharaoh. And now the next 2/3 of the Hebrew Bible I'm sorry, 2/3 of the Torah, those first 5 books. The next 2/3 of the scroll are law, 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 little story, law, 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 a little story that sets up more laws. It's the narrative is minimal. The laws are the large content of what's there. And this concept of having a Jewish religious law, a whole set of commandments that you're supposed to follow, begins with the Torah laws. But it's not limited there. For one example, the rabbis posited that there are 613 commandments in the Torah. And they also added some additional rabbinic commandments, like reading the Purim Megillah or lighting the Hanukkah candles. Those are post-Torah because Hanukkah happens way after the Torah story, right? But they still say you're commanded to light Hanukkah candles by the transitive power of commandment because the rabbis get to command you a few times too. But even within the Torah, with those 613 commandments, no two rabbis agree on exactly what 613 are there when they try to make a list. So they pick the number and then they're trying to find the things that match. They also find out, if you think about it, if you actually read that list of 613 commandments, no one person can fulfill all 613 because you'd have to be a man and a woman, a farmer and a shepherd, living in an urban setting, living in a rural setting, and both a priest and a king, which you're not allowed to be. And only some people are allowed to by pedigree anyways. So no one can fulfill all 613 commandments, and there's no universal agreement on what they are or how to fulfill them. So if it says in the Torah, thou shalt not murder, by the way, the full language is do not murder. It's not thou shalt not kill. You often hear kill. The technical term in Hebrew is murder. But what counts as murder? The Torah even gives an example. If you're chopping wood and the head of the axe flies off the end of the handle and hits someone and kills them, does that count as murder? Well, we would call it accidental homicide or manslaughter or something like that. It's not in the category of murder, but you have to clarify that. If the Torah says you will not kindle a fire on Shabbat, can you leave a candle burning that you lit before Shabbat? Or do you have to put out all the fires and do Shabbat in the dark? What if you set up a little lamp that you light before, and then you take a bag of oil and hang it over the lamp and poke a little hole in the bottom, and then the oil drips down every little bit to keep the fire burning all the way through the next day? Are you violating the halakha, the law? Well, here's where you have a permanent employment for rabbis, deciding what the law is and how it applies to new circumstances. So in addition to the idea of a revelation of a written law on Mount Sinai, there was also a concept in rabbinic thought of an oral Torah, the traditions of how to interpret that were passed down from Moses all the way down, word of mouth, and were ultimately collected in later versions of Jewish law, not just the written Torah, but what is known as the oral Torah. This is the first collection of rabbinic laws in a book called the Mishnah, compiled around 200 of the Common Era. The Torah itself, historically, was probably written about 500 BCE when it's compiled in its final form. So you have the Mishnah coming 700 years later, around 200 of the Common Era. Then there's further discussion, commentary, debate about what the Mishnah has to say that becomes what's called the Gemara. Altogether, Mishnah plus Gemara makes what we call the Talmud. In later generations, because the Talmud had all this discussion and debate back and forth, there are rabbis that create law codes that simply say, here's what you do, and here's when you light the candles, and here's how you kosher your house for Passover, and here's what you do when somebody dies. And it just gives you the laws in a law code. Those begin developing around the year 1100. But there's always new questions that come up. So there's a whole body of rabbinic literature called responsa, where someone asks a question, and then you have to make a decision. I mentioned at the High Holidays most recently last year that the conservative movement came out with a responsa on the debate over, are you allowed to use an electric car on Shabbat? Now, you might remember you're not supposed to use the traditional car on Shabbat because it lights a fire, right? Burns gas. But electric cars don't burn gas. So are you, in theory, you could be argued allowed to drive on Shabbat in an electric car. So rabbis have to debate these new circumstances. How do you handle an elevator? Let's say you're living in a high-rise building. Are you supposed to walk up 30 floors? What if you can't do that? Well, in Orthodox high-rise buildings, they have what they call the Shabbat elevator. I call it the local. It stops and hits every floor, right? But you don't have to push any buttons. You don't have to cause any circuits to be completed. You don't cause any electricity to happen. So these are the workarounds. This is what responses are for, responding to new circumstances. And the body of religious law is called halakha. Halakha is from the same root as to walk. It's the path, the way you should follow. By the way, it's the same in Arabic. Sharia for Muslims is the path, or in Taoism, the Tao is the path. So we have this in other traditions too, the idea that there's one right way to walk through life, and this is what you have to follow. Now, we have to remember also that when we call it religious law, we don't mean it's only about performing the religion. It's not just about rituals, and it's about what you eat and what you wear, and also about how you do business, how you sign a contract, how you enforce a contract, how you marry, how you divorce, how you should plant your fields. It's religious in its source. It's religious in its authority. But it's not what we would box off as religion in our compartmentalized view of the world. So the halakha applies to everything. And rabbis as dayanim, as judges, can judge on anything. There's even a couple jurisdictions in the Western world where rabbinic courts are acceptable as a mediation style alternative to secular law. So if both parties consent, they can go to a rabbinic court and they have to abide by the decision the rabbinic court enforces. Of course, the standards for evidence are different. Women are not accepted as witnesses in Torah courts in Orthodox circumstances. So that's one big issue for sure. But in any case, the idea that there is religious law that's binding and applies to everything, that's the concept of the halakha. And that's also the basis for those people who might claim that Judaism is about deeds and not creeds. Here's how Schwartz summarizes it at the beginning of his chapter on
What did you say?
halakha.
What did you say?
That Judaism is
Deeds?
about deeds and not creeds.
Creeds. Okay, thank you.
Creeds, right. Like what you do and not what you think. And so he says, Judaism is built around commandments. The way Jews celebrate the year is built on the commandments of the holidays. The way Jews celebrate the life cycle is built on ritual commandments from birth to death. The way they aspire to conduct their lives is built on commandments emphasizing moral and ethical acts. For the traditionalist, all the commandments are important. For the non-traditionalist, some of the commandments may be important, but others may not be. And so here he really divides it a little bit differently, where there's the traditionalist and the non-traditionalist, or the Orthodox and everybody else, who on some level are making choices of what they're going to follow. And remember, from those statistics we saw at the beginning of the class, most Jews are making the choices. They're not following all the kosher laws. They're not obeying the Shabbat rules. They're not showing up to synagogue on a weekly basis. 80–90% of Jews are not doing those things. They're making choices in their Judaism. I'll also point out, by the way, that most of those lists of 613 commandments include commandments like believe in God, love God, fear God. So anyone else who wants to try it's not about what you believe, it's only what you think, well, it's only what you do. Any of those lists of what you're supposed to do include what you're supposed to think. So beliefs are always a part of it. Now, for the Orthodox, they understand that they're claiming their law is permanent and that it's an all or nothing proposition. Quoting the former chief rabbi of Great Britain, Emanuel Jacobowitz, the equal sanctity of all parts of the Torah and all of its laws. Any substantive division between ethical and ritual laws is arbitrary and altogether foreign to the text and religious philosophy of the scriptures. So putting on tefillin, the prayer boxes with the straps, just as important as love your neighbor. Maintaining kosher laws, just as important as caring for the widow and the orphan. They're all commandments. You have to do them all. It's not a pick and choose of what you think is most important. And as we're interpreting these, you might think that we've changed them. No, 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 no. Unlike the Constitution, which has some process for amendment, Torah law cannot be amended, only interpreted. The Constitution's writers assumed they were fallible and they wanted to put in a provision to amend the law. But for the traditionalists, the Torah is a sacred document whose laws are God-given and thus binding on the Jewish people. It is inerrant and cannot be amended. It is conveyed in human language that requires a process of comprehension, and only a rabbi trained in the interpretation of halakha, the religious law, is qualified to make a judgment. And even if it looks like you've changed the law by your interpretation, do not be fooled. Halakha, this is quoting an Orthodox authority, halakha possesses an enduring validity, which, while applicable to changing circumstances, is not subject to change by lobbying or the exertion of pressure in any guise or form, nor may independently held convictions, however sincere, be allowed to influence our interpretations of halakha. Normative Judaism teaches that halakha is not derived from a temporal worldview or social situation. It expresses the transcendental worldview of the divine lawgiver. This is what God is telling you to do. However, we know historically the halakha has changed. And I'll give you one example. In Deuteronomy, it says that a stubborn and rebellious child should be stoned to death. Their mother and their father take him to the elders of the city, and they say, "This our son is a glutton and a drunkard. He has not listened to the voice of his mother or to the voice of his father, and he is stubborn and rebellious." And the elders take the child, take him to the outside of the city, and stone him to death. And this is how children will learn to obey their parents. Now, if any of you have had children or been a child, you know that at some point, children are stubborn and rebellious. Some more than others, but definitely it applies to all of them at some point in time. Fully enforcing this law would mean the end of humanity. The rabbis knew this. But this is written in the Torah. What are they supposed to do? Interpretation to the rescue. In the Mishnah, it says, well, the text in the Torah says, ben velo bat, a son but not a daughter. So maybe it doesn't apply to rebellious girls at all. It only applies to rebellious sons. Hey, we've saved half of humanity. Now it says a ben, a son. So that means, well, it can't apply to a minor because we know that minors are exempt from the death penalty. Even if they were to kill somebody, they're a minor, they are not subject to the eye for an eye rule, which they also interpret away. What if they're an adult? Let's say they're 30 years old. Well, they're not a ben, they're not a child anymore, they're not a son. So it really only applies to a limited window of time between the time they're a child and a minor and between the time they're a full adult and on their own. And then they go on to qualify it more. Remember, the parents both come. So both parents have to agree. If one parent refuses, you can't do it. It says, our son is a drunkard and a glutton. Oh, so he has to have drunk a certain amount of wine and eaten a certain amount of food. And so they come up with all these rules to qualify and qualify and qualify. At the end of the discussion, one of the rabbis in the Talmud says, well, there never was a stubborn and rebellious child, and there never will be. You made it impossible. That's how they changed the law. You can't cancel it. You can't just take your pen or your strike-through font and go, bleh. You're stuck with it. But if you interpret, maybe you can interpret it in a way that it softens it and ultimately makes it unenforceable. So the halakha does change. It's just that they don't admit it changes. And as one person said in commenting on the fact that, unfortunately, the laws of divorce are skewed against women, and there's a particular law that produces what's called a bound woman, or an aguna, where the husband refuses to grant her a divorce. It does happen occasionally the other way, where the wife refuses to grant the divorce or accept the divorce decree. But either way, if they refuse to accept the decree, the person is stuck. They can't get remarried. They can't move on with their life. And that hasn't been resolved in the Orthodox world. But as people have said, if there were a halachic will, there'd be a halachic way. If they really wanted to fix this issue for women, they could by all these kind of interpretations from all these other things they've managed to work around. Now, what does the non-traditional Jew think about halakha, religious law? Well, it's on a spectrum. On one end, you have absolute freedom. He actually quotes Sherwin Wine, one of the founders of Humanistic Judaism, that says, secular humanistic Jews neither reject the traditions and history of the Jewish people, nor do they follow observances they consider to be obsolete. They choose, as free humans, out of their splendid and vast heritage, that which is meaningful to their contemporary social, personal, and moral concerns. We are free. We have absolute freedom. We can choose what we want to continue. So if we want to light Hanukkah candles, great. If we don't care about kosher laws, fine. It's our library, and we get to choose what to read and what to do. At the other side of that pillar, though, are the emotional claims of tradition. We grew up with this ritual. We heard our parents recite this prayer, or we saw our parents light the Shabbat candles, and we're attached to our inheritance. We value our connections to the Jewish people. As Rebecca Alpert and Jacob Staub, who wrote a book on Reconstructionist Judaism, put it, Jewish rituals have a sacred history that reflects inherited wisdom as well as group renewal. They should not be discarded casually. We often choose to retain the traditional forms of Jewish practice, even when we no longer mean what our ancestors meant, because such rituals both enrich and sustain us. Or another Reconstructionist thinker, Milton Steinberg, Jews ought not to play fast and loose with their past, lest they lose contact with it. The presumption is in favor of the tradition. So you have to decide, do you keep doing it if it's traditional, except for the things that you can't do anymore because they're just obnoxious? Or are you totally free to choose, and then you pick and choose what you want, even if it's minimal, and that's sufficient because you're making your own choices for your life? You're somewhere in between, right? You're somewhere on those poles. And he quotes from a statement that the Reform Movement issued in 1976, describing this balancing act. Within each area of Jewish observance, Reform Jews are called upon to confront the claims of Jewish tradition, however differently perceived, and to exercise their individual autonomy, choosing and creating on the basis of commitment and knowledge. So know the range of Jewish options, and then you're free to choose. You understand how different this is from a commandedness, from a divine revelation that's binding for all time. So even if you're doing the same things with the same words, the rationale behind it, the emotional valence of it is going to be different in an Orthodox setting versus a Reform conservative or humanistic setting where we're choosing what we're going to continue. Ideally, we choose from a place of knowledge. Sometimes we choose just because it's what we've always done. But in the end, we know that we're not bound. And those statistics on Jewish behavior and ritual performance show how different it is. And to highlight that, Schwartz quotes from one of our humanistic rabbis, Greg Epstein, who's the humanist chaplain at Harvard and MIT. He wrote a book called Good Without God. And in that book, Epstein provides alternative humanistic versions of the 10 Commandments. So I'm actually going to share with you that text. He starts with the King James Bible version. He puts it into modern English, and then he gives a humanist equivalent or version for each of the commandments. So the first one, I am the Lord your God. Do not have any other gods than me or before me. The humanist version he finds is seek the best in yourself and others and believe in your own ability to make a positive difference in the world. So that's human agency instead of divine power. Do not make any graven images or statues. So don't worship idols. A humanist version might be pursue truth and honesty in all you do. Be wary of allowing power, status, and possessions to substitute for moral courage, dignity, and goodness. So don't worship secular idols, right? Or material success or things like that. Do not misuse the name of God. Number 3, he says, be positive and constructive rather than negative or disrespectful. Remember the Sabbath day to rest. To be healthy, you must balance work, play, and rest, is a humanist version. Honor your mother and father. All members of the family should respect each other, so bi-directional, right? Thou shalt not kill, same. Thou shalt not commit adultery, same. Some of them work, same. And finally, thou shalt not covet. When you see nice things owned by others, let them be your inspiration rather than a source of bad feelings. If you want it, work hard to get them. So it's sort of a humanist adaptation of the Ten Commandments, but the point that's more important from Epstein's text and from our approach is whether we reject the entire category of commandedness. Because after all, what Greg Epstein is offering is advice, strongly worded suggestions. That's not commandment. So where I disagree with Schwartz's summary in this section is that he's claiming that even secular Jews, even humanistic Jews, follow commandments of some kind because they're picking and choosing, but we're picking and choosing from cultural practices. And the fact that we're picking and choosing means we're not just doing it because it's in the Torah. Because if we were, we'd be keeping kosher too, because that's there too. We don't only do it because it's written, we do it because we've chosen it. And the fact that it echoes with our ancestral past means that we're still free. We're just free to choose to do something the old-fashioned way. And once you're free to choose it, the meaning of the performance is very different. So I would argue that we reject the very concept of mitzvah as commandment. We'll accept mitzvot as good deeds, being an ethical person for sure. And we could even use some of those formulations of our past. But the idea that we're commanded to do anything, well, I don't think we are. Not by a commander, capital C, or by the commandments of tradition. We are autonomous agents and we get to choose. And the fact that we're choosing, even if we choose something traditional, means it's not a commandment. So that's a quick overview of Jewish religious law, halakha, and the idea of commandments. What do you think about that question of commandedness? And if you do something Jewish, is it a commandment? Is it something else? How do you understand?
I actually wanted to say that as you were explaining all of this, I was thinking how wonderful this is. And that if this was Orthodox, women wouldn't even be part of the discussion. And so in terms of your question about commandments, that I think that's going around and around in my head. I think obviously, no, it's not obvious. It's not that I do not feel commanded because I do not believe in God. I don't believe in the Torah as the word of God. But I just did want to get out there that I can't really sink my teeth into any religion that denigrates or limits more than half of the world's population by not allowing them to participate in discussions like this or decisions, even if they try to disguise it as something, oh, you have more important things to do and things like that. So I just wanted to make that point because I think we often forget how bad it is on the orthodoxy for women who are more than half of the world's population. And I'll stop talking there.
Well, I will also point out that there are varieties of orthodoxy. So some Orthodox communities are more affirmative of women's study, even of Talmud. And there are even some communities that accept women as what's called a yoetzet halakha, or a decider of Jewish law, often focused on the laws applying to women, but nevertheless with some authority to make Jewish legal decisions in those contexts. So there are communities that define themselves as Orthodox that do allow and even encourage women to study what they consider to be the prestige subjects of Torah, Talmud, and so on.
Even outside the U.S.?
Yeah, even in Australia and Europe, in some places, in Israel, even there are some places that are ordaining women in some kind of Jewish clergy capacity, whether they call them Rav or Rabbah or Ravanit or some other kind of title, or Yoetzet Halakha is another one, Maharat's another one. There are Jewish experiences that call themselves Orthodox but affirm women's learning. Now, the ultra-Orthodox do not. The Haredi do not. But there's debates within Orthodoxy of what's Orthodox and what's not. And one of the fault lines is the treatment of women. Some communities have a women's section with what's called a mechitza, a dividing line, that's very rigid. Others have a very low bar, and they're standing in separate gender groups, but everyone can see what's going on in the service and can participate in their own way. So it really depends on what the community is and how they approach. They accept the label Orthodox, but it's a lot more diverse. This kind of a book that's sort of painting with a broad brush because it's only, well, how many pages? Like 250 pages, more or less. You can't get into all the subtleties all the time. So we should just note, sort of for the record, that there's Orthodox and there's Orthodox, and some are more women affirmative than others.
Thank you. I was not aware of that.
Well, it's obviously very far from our experience, right? It's not our approach to the world. And I can appreciate people that like to have things prescribed for them, that like to have rules in place. But that isn't how I work. I mean, think of it this way. I'll give you two anecdotes to explain it. It is true, as someone said in the first half of the class, that sometimes people need laws and they want laws. They want to be told what to do. But we also make our own choices. How many of you obey the speed limit to the number? Most people speed a few miles an hour, 5 miles an hour, 8 miles an hour. They all have their margin of error. They think they can get away with it without getting a ticket or being unsafe. Most of us would not go 50 miles an hour in a 25-mile-an-hour zone because we wouldn't feel safe. But most of us wouldn't go 25 miles an hour in a 25-mile-an-hour zone either. I mean, maybe I'm a lead foot and I don't understand other people's experience, but if I'm behind someone going 25, it's unusual. Most people are going faster than 25. So we're choosing how exactly we want to do this, just like the number of Jews that keep kosher versus the number of Jews that do a Passover Seder, because you can do it in your own way, or light Hanukkah candles, because you can do it at home in your own way. It's very different than going to synagogue on Yom Kippur and having to do it in a specific way. The other anecdote I want to share is my father grew up in an Orthodox community in New York, and he left it and went off into liberal, ultimately humanistic Judaism. My uncle always stayed in that community and lived an Orthodox lifestyle his whole life. And once my father was visiting, and they wanted to go for a walk on Shabbat afternoon, because of course there's nothing to do on Shabbat. There's no power, there's no electricity. So you study or you take a walk or take a nap or whatever. So he and his brother were about to go outside. It was raining out. So my father went to reach for an umbrella. And my uncle said, no, you can't use an umbrella. My dad said, why not? My uncle said, well, the rabbis have decided that it's like building a house. My father said, do you think it's like building a house? My uncle's response was, not for me to think. The rabbis, the experts have decided that it's like building a house. And my father just could not live in that world of the rabbis have said, and therefore you have to follow. Now, we have authorities too. We call them judges and scientists and researchers, right? Ideally, they have data to back up their claims, but they also have authority that we listen to. So the fact that Orthodox Jews have authorities that they listen to is not unusual. It's just what they allow the authorities to tell them to do that we would say goes too far. If you want an umbrella on a Saturday, use it. That's the difference in our approach. You don't have to check with a rabbi, even me, to use an umbrella. I give you a blanket permission to stay dry, stay safe.
I think that, looking at the statistics that you were showing at the beginning of class, that at least amongst American Jews, that the commandedness is disappearing to a great degree. I mean, clearly people are not, the overwhelming majority of Jews don't do this anymore. They still have some things that they want to be told to do, and I think it makes them comfortable to have a structure for things. I mean, even us, we're the humanists, but we still like to do the comfort of the high holidays. And, even if we don't fast on Yom Kippur, we still like to do Yom Kippur. You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, I think humans are comfortable with structure that's given to them rather than creating it themselves to a great degree until it gets uncomfortable, like Chinese food. And then there goes kosher.
Yeah. Well, also because it was what was open on Christmas.
Yeah.
One year at Kol Hadash, I forgot to ask people to stand as we put the Torah scroll back at the high holiday services. I just forgot. It wasn't any kind of ideological statement, but I had several people come up to me afterwards to say, why didn't you have a stand to put the Torah scroll back? And they don't believe the Torah was written by God, and we don't parade it around and kiss it or do any of that stuff. I ask people to stand and take it out as a sign of respect for the wisdom of our past. And we do the same when we do our Jewish literature reading the next morning that isn't from the Torah. But the fact that I forgot to tell them to stand, but the lack of routine, the break in the ritual, sort of was a speed bump for them. And that's human. So we certainly understand the human impulse to do it the same old way. All right. Well, thanks for joining us to explore Torah and tradition. We're going to talk next time about questions of Jewish identity and Israel, obviously hot topics these days and most days. So hopefully you'll join us for that, and we'll see some more about what Jews believe. Any other last thoughts or comments?
Just thank you. It was a revelation.